They say if you stand at the edge of Pleasant Hill right before dawn, you can still hear the whispers of the missing, but no one tells you what they whisper, because the truth isn't just buried, it's been sealed, like a coffin nailed shut from the inside. People didn't vanish. They were erased. Welcome to the community the state of Kentucky wants you to forget. Pleasant Hill wasn't a place of God. It was a machine, engineered to unmake the self, to turn free men into obedient tools and silence into doctrine. This was no accident. It was a system, calibrated, sharpened, perfected over decades, all while smiling behind pious words and handcrafted furniture. And at the center of it, the Richardson family, a lineage that didn't worship God. They worshipped control. What if I told you everything you know about religious utopias, about purity, simplicity, peace, was a lie crafted by those who understood one chilling truth? He who controls belief controls behavior. This is not a ghost story. This is an operation. Over the next hour, you will see the structure, the architecture of one of the most psychologically advanced control systems ever built on American soil. A system that didn't just hide its crimes, it made its victims participate in their own disappearance. You think you know what cults are? You haven't seen the real ones, the ones that wear uniforms, carry licenses, and register as tax-exempt. Pleasant Hill was a prototype, and the reason it was buried is because it worked. So take a breath, because once we step into this story, there's no coming back unchanged. If you're not afraid of dangerous truth, then stay with me. And if you're ready to awaken something that can't be unawakened, comment this phrase now: truth isn't sacred, power is, and comment it again at the halfway point, not for me, for you. Because when this is over, you won't look at your church, your family, or your history the same way ever again. It began, as many of the most sinister tales do, with purity. Kentucky was being swept by the Second Great Awakening, a wildfire of spiritual hunger, spreading across broken families and bruised towns, still aching from war and poverty. People weren't just looking for God. They were looking for structure, for order, for someone to tell them, "You're safe now, you belong." Enter Pleasant Hill, a Shaker community that promised to strip away the filth of the world and give you something cleaner, nobler, holier. But what they didn't tell you was this: purity movements aren't built to cleanse the soul. They're built to erase the self, because when you demand absolute separation from the world, you leave yourself open to absolute control from within. The Shaker rules were strict. No marriage, no private property, no questioning of the elders, no contact with family outside the community. Every meal you ate, every hour you worked, every prayer you whispered was observed, logged, judged. But under the banner of peace and spiritual devotion, something else was growing. A new hierarchy, not based on divinity, but on dominance. The Richardson family, especially Elder Samuel, saw what others missed: that if you can control a person's rituals, you control their reality. They weren't interested in salvation, they were interested in system design, and Pleasant Hill was their laboratory. It's easy to manipulate broken people. It's even easier to make them grateful for the manipulation. That's how the conditioning started. Small at first, harmless. You gave up your name, then your possessions, then your memories, then your questions, and then you thanked them. The Richardsons installed themselves at every pressure point: food, sleep, money, relationships, confession, punishment. Their reach wasn't obvious. It was meticulous, surgical, and it didn't need to be enforced. And by fear, because fear implies resistance. They built something far more powerful, dependency. They trained people to fear freedom, and that's the genius of a perfect control system. When the prisoner stops asking for the key and starts fearing the door. You may be thinking, but these were good people, right? Religious people. Understand this now. Not all devils wear horns. Some wear wool robes and speak in tongues. This was no accident. This was architecture, and the blueprints still exist. Every cult needs a god. Pleasant Hill had many, but they all wore one name, Richardson. They didn't scream or threaten. They didn't need to. Their power wasn't loud. It was structural, institutional. It lived inside the bones of Pleasant Hill. Samuel Richardson wasn't just a preacher. He was a designer of people, routines, relationships, guilt. He had the kind of voice that didn't raise volume because silence obeyed it. His sermons were velvet-covered weapons. He spoke of God's will, but meant his own. And by the time you realized the difference, you were already kneeling. At his side stood Martha, wife in secret, sister in public. They called it celibacy. But behind the closed door of her quarters, the lie was both intimate and strategic. She was the nervous system of the community, quietly managing threats before they spoke, sensing which members would break and when. Martha's smile was not motherly. It was surgical. She didn't just control people, she reformatted them. Together, the Richardsons embedded their blood into every organ of the community. Ezekiel, the eldest son, oversaw the fields, the food, the money. He knew exactly how much the land produced and how much truth he could bury under it. Caleb, the watcher, the listener. He didn't just supervise. He monitored every conversation, every letter, every cough in the wrong direction. Rebecca, the daughter with the angelic voice and the predator's eyes. She guided new members through orientation. She didn't welcome people, she stripped them. And when they cried in her arms at night, they were crying into the arms of their captor. Isaiah, the cousin. On the surface, a seed merchant. But his travels gave the family what every dictator dreams of, an external operation. He could deliver more than produce. He could deliver people, to or from, and no one would question it. Even the old ones had a role. Mother Sarah, the family matriarch, looked harmless, but in secret she was the strategic mind behind decades of coercion and subtle shifts. She remembered who doubted, and waited until they didn't. Make no mistake, this was no loving religious order. This was a dynasty, a family cartel, and they ran Pleasant Hill like a private kingdom behind stained glass walls. And when someone questioned their rule, they didn't silence them with noise. They used something far more devastating, oblivion. At Pleasant Hill, no one ever screamed. Not because there wasn't pain, but because even your screams were accounted for. The disappearances didn't come with warning. No locked doors, no midnight chases, no sounds of struggle echoing through the halls. Just absence. One day, Brother Elias was tending the herb garden. The next morning, gone. No explanation, no announcement, no mention at breakfast. His bed, remade. His boots, reassigned. His name, vanished from the morning ledger. Sister Ruth, a quiet woman who once questioned the timing of food rations, disappeared during a morning prayer circle. She was kneeling during hymn 5. By hymn 8, her space was empty. No one asked. Because to ask was to invite your own erasure. This was the brilliance and horror of the Richardson regime. They turned vanishing into a ritual. It wasn't chaotic, it was bureaucratic, a process, a system. They called it retreat, a spiritual sabbatical, they said, a place for doubters and questioners to purge their worldly attachments. But those who went to retreat never came back. Scattered across the forest surrounding Pleasant Hill were small cabins, rustic, isolated, designed with no windows and doors that only locked from the outside. You were sent to one after expressing the wrong thought, a note in your journal, a tone in your voice, a private glance of hesitation. That was all it took. The family would smile gently. "We think you need time to reconnect with the divine," they'd say. Inside, you'd find a Bible, and nothing else. No water, no food unless Sister Hannah's herbal brews were delivered. No warmth, even in winter. Some were left for days, others for weeks, and then not at all. When your presence became too inconvenient, your spiritual transition would be announced the next Sunday. "We mourn their passing into glory," said Samuel with fold. Ed hands, but the ground was never dug. No funeral pyres, no grave markers, only ashes behind the furniture workshop, only silence in the record books. Over time, the community didn't even flinch. They learned asking means disappearing, and so they smiled harder. They sang louder. They worked longer, all while pretending not to see the empty chairs beside them. This wasn't just fear. It was manufactured amnesia. Pleasant Hill didn't bury bodies. It buried memories. Shall I take you deeper? It wasn't just the Richardsons who kept the secret. It was everyone. You see, over time, Pleasant Hill didn't need threats. It didn't need chains. It didn't even need walls. Because the real prison was built inside the minds of its members. Each disappearance taught the same brutal lesson. You survive by forgetting. When Sister Ruth vanished, her best friend Sister Abigail wept silently that night. But the next morning, she was in the dining hall serving oats, singing hymns, smiling like the world was whole. She'd learned her role. She'd learned that grief is rebellion, and rebellion gets noticed. Even children were taught early. There was a game they played behind the granary. Last Seen, they called it. They'd take turns naming a member who vanished. Each child would share the last time they saw them, fetching water, raking leaves, singing blessed quietness. Then they'd go silent, a silence that lasted as long as they could hold their breath. The longer the breath, the purer your soul, they were told. But that game wasn't innocence. It was indoctrination, a ritual rehearsal for disappearance. Because if you could stay silent long enough, maybe you'd never be the one they forgot next. The community didn't need to be policed. They policed themselves. Brother Caleb's surveillance was precise, yes. But by 1815, he didn't even need to read private journals anymore. Members had already begun self-editing their thoughts. Doubts were sins. Questions were disease. Curiosity was a confession. Even dreams became dangerous. A sister once whispered in sleep, "Where is Ezekiel?" By sunrise, she was called to retreat. After that, members trained themselves to sleep with blank minds, their dreams purged by evening prayer. There were no mirrors in Pleasant Hill, not because of vanity, but because mirrors reflect truth, and truth was no longer allowed. Ruth here was whatever the Richardsons spoke in the Sunday chapel. Everything else, heretical noise. You may think, why didn't they run? Because where would they go? Every family contact had been severed. Letters were never delivered. The world beyond Pleasant Hill, painted as a demonic wasteland filled with temptation and death, freedom had been redefined as betrayal. And betrayal vanished. So they learned the script. They wore the smiles. They performed the rituals. They traded reality for obedience, and in doing so, they became their own wardens. But something changed in the winter of 1820. Someone refused to forget. Someone remembered the missing names and carved them into something the Richardsons couldn't burn. Are you ready to meet her? Her name was Eliza Mayfield. She was only 11 when her mother vanished from the dormitories. They told her it was an act of divine calling, that Sister Helena had been chosen for heavenly work. But Eliza knew better. Her mother had been scrubbing the chapel steps at dusk. Her apron was still damp. Her boots were still lined up beneath the bed. She hadn't packed. She hadn't said goodbye. She'd simply been erased. Eliza didn't cry. She didn't protest. Not in the open. But that night, she crept out of the girls' dormitory and into the old woodworking barn. She found an abandoned plank and a rusted chisel, and she carved a single word: Helena. Each letter was shaky, jagged, too large, but it was real. It was the first record Pleasant Hill couldn't erase, and it wouldn't be the last. Every month, another name would vanish, and every time Eliza would return to that same barn, carving the names into the underside of the rafters where no one would see. Miriam, Thomas, Ezra, Ruth, Jacob. By her 12th birthday, there were 14 names, and each one was a crime. Because in Pleasant Hill, remembering was treason, but forgetting was the death of the soul. Eliza wrote their stories in whispers, etched in stolen minutes between chores. She even fashioned a small hidden drawer beneath the barn floor. Inside, she placed scraps of cloth, buttons, locks of hair, tokens the vanished had left behind. A secret archive, a child's rebellion, a memory buried in the bones of a dead place. She once told her only confidant, a mute boy named Jonah, "They want us to be ghosts before we die, but if I remember them, they're not gone. Not really." Jonah never spoke, but one day he left a drawing beneath her pillow, a crude map of the property with one cabin marked in red, Retreat Number 3. It was where Sister Helena had been sent the week before she disappeared. That night, Eliza crept to the cabin alone. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scorch marks, blood, and a single silver pendant, her mother's cross, half melted in the hearth. No Shaker doctrine could explain that. No prayer could undo it. Eliza didn't scream. She didn't run. She went back to the barn and added another name. And from that night forward, her carvings changed. She no longer recorded just the lost. She began documenting how they vanished. It was the beginning of her real rebellion, the start of a silent war, and eventually, the thing that made her dangerous enough to destroy. The Richardson family had mastered the art of vanishing people, not just their bodies, but their existence. They understood something vital. History isn't written by the victors, it's written by the survivors. So they made sure no one survived with a memory that threatened the illusion. Each time a member went missing, there was a procedure. First, their name was quietly removed from the community roster. Sister patients would update the official ledgers by candlelight, a careful scratch of quill across old parchment, as if that name had never been there. Next, Brother Caleb would confiscate all personal belongings, letters, journals, clothing, photographs. He moved like a ghost in the early hours, erasing lives while the rest of Pleasant Hill still slept. Witnesses were not questioned. They were reassigned. Then came the most chilling stage, the fire. Beneath the chapel, in a stone-lined chamber once used to store grain, the Richardsons had constructed what they called the Sanctum, a ritual room for what they claimed were purification rites. In reality, it was an incinerator for truth. Dozens of metal bins lined the walls, each marked with faded initials. Inside, ash, charred wood, remnants of destroyed belongings. One bin was labeled TW, another EM. Eliza Mayfield had found it months before her own disappearance. She knew the initials. She knew what they meant. And when she found a scorched piece of a child's doll in the bottom of one, she knew she was next. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't what they burned. It was what they kept. Hidden in a false wall behind the sanctum was the Red Ledger, a single book bound in oxblood leather. Inside were detailed logs, dates, names, reasons, not of when members joined, but of when they were deemed expendable. One entry read, Rebecca L., age 14, excessive questioning, shows memory retentio, and of retreat trauma, observed comforting others, suggest removal within the week. Another, Jonah M. Mute Boy, suspected of aiding dissidents, drawings found under Eliza's mattress, terminate quietly, a tribute to illness. These weren't just disappearances. They were executions disguised as salvation. Pleasant Hill didn't just punish rebellion. It diagnosed it as spiritual disease. Then it cured it with fire, poison, and silence. If you're still watching this, comment below. Memory is defiance. Memory is defiance. Twice. To mark yourself as someone they would have feared. Because now you know what they tried to bury, and what comes next is the part they couldn't burn. If the fire was for evidence, the cabins were for people. Not far from Pleasant Hill's main compound, buried within the blackwoods and fog-covered hollows, stood a ring of secluded shacks known only to a few by name. The community called them retreat cabins, places for renewal of spirit, but they were no more sacred than a prison cell with a hymn on the wall. Each cabin was hand-built under the direction of Brother Jeremiah. Stone floors, barred shutters, a locking door from the outside only. They were painted in muted whites and grays to mimic purity, but the walls inside were scarred with fingernail scratches and the desperate scribbles of those who had been locked in too long. New members who displayed curiosity, independent thought, or longing for the outside were often told they needed spiritual detoxification. Their retreat would last a week, but many never returned, or if they did, they were not the same. Sister Martha oversaw their spiritual reformation. She believed the soul was clay, and fear, hunger, and isolation were the tools God gave to sculpt obedience. Those who emerged from the cabins after a week spoke softly, stared too long at the floor, and repeated phrases as if rehearsed. I've been shown the path again. My doubt was selfishness. They saved me. But Eliza Mayfield, she wasn't one of the lucky ones. Because she remembered. In the spring of 1829, Eliza was locked in cabin 6 after being caught sketching a map of the grounds with an escape route highlighted. She had been planning to flee with 2 other girls, both orphans taken in from Louisville. The girls vanished the next night. Eliza was dragged by Brother Caleb through the rain, her bare feet slicing on shale, her screams swallowed by the forest. She was gone for 11 days. When she returned, her hair had been cut short, a ritual humiliation, and her eyes didn't focus. For weeks she wandered Pleasant Hill, mumbling things the Richardsons tried to pass off as confused visions, until one night she stood in the dining hall, staring directly at Samuel Richardson, and whispered, "The fire can't unright me." The next morning, she was gone, her bed stripped, her name scratched from every record. But 2 weeks later, Sister Mary found a torn page tucked behind the chapel altar. Eliza's handwriting. It read, "Cabin 6 has no spirit, only screams." These weren't retreats. They were correctional vaults for soul manipulation, and when that failed, they became tombs. Now, do you want to know who else disappeared into those woods? It began with whispers, then rumors, then numbers. There were names that stopped being spoken, faces that no longer appeared at morning chores. Beds made but never unmade, Bibles left untouched on chapel pews. And then came the ledger. Brother Nathan Richardson, charming and composed, kept the community's official census, a handwritten document updated monthly, publicly read aloud at worship meetings to showcase Pleasant Hill's growth in spiritual numbers. For years, no one questioned it. But Sister Mary Caldwell, the orphaned housemaid who once smelled almonds in Brother Thomas's room, did something no one else dared. She kept her own list, quietly, for years, scribbled on linen scraps and hidden beneath loose floorboards in the washroom walls. She knew every member, when they arrived, when they worked, when they last smiled, and she started to see the pattern. People were disappearing, not leaving, disappearing. The official ledger showed consistent numbers, 384, 387, 390, always growing, never shrinking. But Mary's list, it began diverging from the public count in 1812. By 1834, her records showed 313 names unaccounted for. Gone. No funerals, no transfer notes, no explanations, just gone. Some vanished after asking to visit family. Others disappeared following prayer retreats. A few were never seen again after Sister Rebecca's counseling sessions. A carpenter's apprentice, Jonah Riley, was last seen carrying tools toward Cabin 3. A widowed mother, Eleanor Paxton, reportedly cried during morning worship, and the next day her bed was stripped and her name was reassigned to a new convert. But the most disturbing disappearances involved children, especially orphans. Over the years, Pleasant Hill had developed a reputation for righteous adoption, welcoming dozens of abandoned or orphaned children from across Kentucky. Donors praised the Richardsons for their kindness. Churches across the South sent tithes to support what they believed was the most benevolent Shaker mission in America. But those children, their names stopped appearing after 2 or 3 months. Some were said to have run away. Some were sent to sister communities, but no one ever visited, and no one ever heard from them again. The local sheriff, William Morrison, once asked about the missing Paxton girl, 9 years old, black curls, big hazel eyes. Brother Nathan showed him a forged letter claiming she had been reunited with a distant aunt in Tennessee. The letter looked perfect, so the sheriff left, satisfied. But Mary Caldwell had seen the girl's name on both ledgers. One crossed out, one replaced with another name. Same handwriting. She tried to report it, twice. The first time her room was searched. The second time, her cat was found dead outside the dairy barn. Its eyes removed, its body folded like prayer. Mary never tried again. And yet, she kept the ledger. A secret scripture, proof that this sanctuary was a harvesting ground, not for souls, but for silence. And by 1834, the missing had reached 313. Would you like to see what happened in 1835? They called it the blessing of the threshold. But to those who witnessed it, those still alive enough to feel terror, it was something else, a ritual, a reckoning. The final stage in a pattern so perfectly concealed, it had survived for 27 years under the guise of holiness. Spring 1835. The gardens bloomed unnaturally fast that year. The vegetables doubled in size. Visitors remarked on the miraculous abundance of Pleasant Hill's crops. But Mary Caldwell, she knew why. She knew who had vanished the night before the sudden spring surge. The 313th name was Sister Abigail, just 14 years old, bright, curious, born inside the community. She had recently begun writing poetry, Poems that questioned why the outside world was forbidden, why no letters ever came, why the other children had stopped showing up to evening song. 3 nights after she left one of her poems beneath the chapel door, she disappeared. No one searched. Instead, the Richardsons held a blessing, a sunrise gathering in the north field. The entire community lined up in rows, singing hymns chosen by Sister Martha. Brother Caleb passed around a silver bowl filled with warm water mixed with crushed chamomile, valerian root, and a few drops of something bitter that made tongues go numb. Elder Samuel, standing before the great oak tree, raised a leather-bound book. Not a Bible. Not the Bible. It was older, bound in flesh, smelling of rot and salt. In that field, he read a passage none had ever heard before. The language, part Latin, part something else, made the air shimmer. Sister Rebecca led the chant, and the chant made the children cry. Mary watched from the dairy house loft. She wasn't supposed to be there. At exactly 6:13 a.m., as the sun rose over the hill and cast its light on the congregation, every member bowed, and Samuel whispered one name, only one. Abigail. The air fell silent. Not a single bird sang, not a leaf moved. Then came the smell, the same almond scent from Brother Thomas's room. But this time, it coated the entire field. So thick that members began coughing, covering their faces. Some vomited. The Richardsons stood still, serene, unbothered, as if they'd been expecting it. Then, it was gone. And in the space where Sister Abigail's bed had been, in the dormitory that evening, was a folded white cloth. Her poem, rewritten in perfect script, and beneath it, a silver coin stamped with a symbol no one recognized, an eye split by a blade, resting on a chalice. Mary took it, hid it, and later, when she held it under candlelight, the metal felt hot. The community never spoke of Abigail again. Her absence became a commandment. But Mary knew something had culminated that morning. Some cycle had closed, and something else, something older, had begun. Do you feel it now? It wasn't God, not the one you were taught to fear, not the one they wrote about in their polished Bibles. What lived beneath Pleasant Hill was something older, darker, and far less merciful. Its name was never spoken aloud, not by the Richardsons, not in sermons, not in prayer. But its presence was everywhere, hidden in the geometric patterns carved into chapel beams, encoded in the rhythms of their chants, etched into the base of the old cistern where the children were forbidden to play. It had rules, it had demands, and every 37 moons it required a sacrifice, but not just of flesh, of faith, of innocence, of unquestioned devotion. The underground chamber was discovered by accident in 1836, or so the story goes. Brother Jeremiah had been expanding the wine cellar when he struck a hollow resonance beneath the stone. What they found was not a natural cave. It was built, carved with inhuman precision. 10 spiraling steps led to a room of pure black rock, perfectly circular, exactly 13 feet wide. In the center, a stone pedestal, waist-high, with a narrow channel carved down its side, designed to catch and drain blood, and behind it, embedded in the wall, was a relief that no one could understand. An eye, a crown of thorns, a child upside down, and 7 hands reaching upward, not in worship, but in fear. Samuel Richardson called it the root. He claimed the Shakers had been led to Pleasant Hill not by divine providence, but by this benevolent architect, a power buried since before the settlers came, before the Shawnee, before the mound builders. This was pre-human, a thing that slept deep in the limestone, drinking silence and feeding on obedience. Every ritual, every rule, every act of control in Pleasant Hill was not meant to protect its people. It was meant to contain the hunger of what lived below. And the Richardsons, they weren't prophy. They were custodians. They believed submission kept the thing asleep, but blood, pure innocent blood, kept it satisfied. The disappearances were offerings, calculated, measured, always on nights when the fog wouldn't lift, always after a hymn in the old tongue was sung in reverse. Mary found pages in Martha Richardson's hidden journal, stained with iron ink, torn at the edges, describing the pulses in the floorboards, the whispers from the well, and the moment when Abigail's blood touched the pedestal. The rock moved, breathing, opening. And then it spoke, not in words, but in visions. She described a city made of bone, an inverted sky, and towers that wept light. She claimed she saw her own soul being measured and devoured. Mary ran that night, but not before copying what she saw. Mary Caldwell was never the same after what she saw in Martha Richardson's journal. A simple girl once known for her humility and kindness was now haunted, trembling at shadows, whispering numbers no one understood. But before she fled Pleasant Hill, she made copies, drawings. Not artistic renditions. These were blueprints, geometric, precise, mathematically impossible, and one stood out above the rest. A circle within a square, a 7-pointed star within the circle, and at the very center, not an eye, but a hole, an absence. She called it the aperture of God. It wasn't until 1987 that these sketches resurfaced, hidden in a family Bible locked in an attic in Danville, Kentucky. Mary had fled there in 1836, taken in by a Methodist pastor who thought her ravings were signs of demonic possession. She died in a local asylum 10 years later, but her drawings remained untouched, untranslated, unburned. When a visiting researcher from the University of Chicago found them, they were cataloged as religious delusions. But one physicist in the team noticed something that chilled him. The symbols matched gravitational anomalies observed beneath specific parts of the Appalachian limestone belt, places where compasses spin and animals refuse to cross. Pleasant Hill was one. Another was Mammoth Cave, America's deepest cave system, just 90 miles south. Mary's largest drawing showed something beneath. A lattice of hollow tunnels, pulsing nodes, lines that intersected at one point, Pleasant Hill. At the center of it all was a shape labeled in shaky, terrified handwriting. Oculus in Kaisis Dei, the eye in God's blindness. And the longer experts stared at it, the more they began to see it move. People who studied the drawing experienced nosebleeds, vomiting, sudden blackouts, and in 2 cases, psychotic breaks. So the documents were quietly seized by federal agents. The university denied their existence. The attic was cleared. The Bible destroyed in a fire, but one scanned copy remains, floating in obscure corners of the dark web. Pixelated, corrupted, but enough to make out the symbols, enough to see the truth. A power older than religion, worshipped in secrecy, fed by obedience, and protected by history's silence. But why? Why protect something so ancient, so dangerous? Because those who serve it believe it is not a demon, but a God, a necessary God, who keeps the world sane by consuming those who question it. That's why Mary Caldwell was erased, why her sketches never made it to public record, why the land around Pleasant Hill is still restricted for ecological research, because the eye still watches. He was only 9 years old. His name was Jacob Merton. In 1992, his family moved into a small farmhouse less than 5 miles from the ruins of Pleasant Hill, a property sold cheap, buried in historical restrictions no one could explain. His parents, devout Pentecostals, believed the land would bless them, a holy place. But Jacob saw something else. It began with dreams, not nightmares, maps. He'd wake up screaming numbers: 7, morphine 3, 13, 13, 13, 313. He scratched them into walls, whispered them in his sleep. His drawings resembled Mary Caldwell's. But Jacob had never heard of her. No one had, not officially. And then he disappeared. Not ran away, not taken, erased. His parents called the sheriff. No one came. They drove to town and were told, "You never had a son." Neighbors who'd seen Jacob grow up suddenly claimed he was imaginary. Old class photos were missing him. Even church records, gone. The town pastor said, "Children are gifts from God, but sometimes God takes them back." 2 weeks later, the farmhouse burned. No cause found. The family vanished. No forwarding address, no explanation, but Jacob's notebook remained, recovered from a crawlspace under the ruined house, untouched by flame. Inside, his last message was scribbled across 37 pages. "I saw it. I saw it see me. I saw it want me. It isn't gone. It's underneath. It watches from underneath. The numbers are mouths. The dirt is its skin. It lives on names. Don't say your name. Don't say your name." And on the last page, one word written in a spiral: Oculus. Researchers who examined the book in 1993 experienced seizures. It was declared a hoax, a forgery, locked away in the Mercer County Historical Society's restricted archive. But in 2003, a night janitor stole photos of the notebook and leaked them online. One image, just one, shows a sketch nearly identical to the E.I. Mary Caldwell drew in 1836. But this time, the aperture is open, and what it shows inside cannot be described, only felt. Viewers report nausea, shaking, a feeling of being watched through the screen. This is why the eye survives, because those who see it either forget or become part of the silence. You were never supposed to find this part, but now that you're here, there's no going back. In 2014, a Freedom of Information Act request submitted by a retired archivist, Thomas Wexley, yielded a stack of heavily redacted documents, all stamped "Property of the U.S. Bureau of Religious Affairs, Eyes Only." You've never heard of that bureau, have you? That's because it doesn't officially exist. Not in any public register, not in the budget. But according to internal memos dating back to 1968, it operates under the Department of Interior, and its sole purpose? To monitor anomalous activity within isolated theological settlements. Pleasant Hill is mentioned 47 times. One file, Operation Fallow, outlines a surveillance initiative launched in 1971. 2 agents embedded in Mercer County to observe lingering psychological effects in descendants of original Shaker bloodlines. The file includes bizarre biometric studies, altered sleep patterns, unusual resistance to sedation, recurring themes of watchers beneath the chapel. The memos don't name names, but they mention child disappearances. They reference ambient trauma fields around the ruins. And most damning of all, they cite containment protocols. One directive from 1984 reads, "In the event of secondary exposure via legacy bloodline, initiate Section 13 clearance sweep, neutralize civilian memory anchors, Restore acceptable historical narrative, civilian memory, anchors. Do you understand what that means? That every witness is treated like a threat to national security. Wexley never lived to see his FOIA request published. He was found dead in his garage. Carbon monoxide poisoning, they said. But there was one thing out of place, a post-it note on his refrigerator, in all caps, written 3 times. I do not speak the names. I do not speak the names. I do not speak the names. When Res. Urchers followed up with the Bureau of Religious Affairs. They were told it never existed. Phone numbers disconnected. Buildings vacated. No trace of employment records. But the files were real. The signatures, the stamps, the directives. In your world, it's easier to mock this, to call it fiction, conspiracy. But the truth? The institutions we trust most, the ones claiming to protect us, are often the ones guarding the rot beneath our feet. It isn't just what happened at Pleasant Hill. It's that they knew, and they decided you didn't need to. If you thought this was just about one orphanage, one family, or even one century, you're mistaken. Because there's something older beneath Pleasant Hill, something deeper than the Richardsons, older than the Shakers, older than Kentucky itself. It begins with a symbol carved into wood, stone, skin, a spiral enclosed in a triangle, sometimes upright, sometimes inverted. They called it the Mark of the Seed. It appears on the foundation stones of Pleasant Hill's chapel, on the floorboards beneath the altar, on the backs of certain children found wandering the woods in trance-like states. No one speaks of the symbol openly, but every community member was taught to fear it, to avoid rooms bearing its presence, to burn anything etched with its likeness. But the deeper researchers dug, the more this mark showed up, not just in Pleasant Hill, but across early colonial settlements, etched into barn beams in Salem, scratched into pews in Quebecois missions, tattooed on the shoulder blades of dead orphans found in a Pennsylvania convent in 1832. Even older references were found in Etruscan burial rites, where the same symbol represented the root beneath names, a god or force forbidden from being named aloud, a power associated with rebirth through suffering, and obedience through silence. An 1847 journal entry from Sister Patience Richardson mentions it only once. The child we buried beneath the elder tree bore the mark. Still warm when her lips whispered something I dare not write. We sang the hymn backward, as Mother instructed. Still, I fear the roots remember. The roots remember. This wasn't just control, it wasn't just manipulation, it was ritual, a system designed not only to erase identity, but to plant something in its place, a seed that could germinate in the mind, twist thoughts, rewrite loyalty. Survivors describe dreams of being buried alive, as of songs with no words, of faces without eyes, all whispering, obedience is the womb, silence is the cradle. You can dismiss this as hysteria. You can call it folklore. But why, then, has every known structure bearing this symbol either burned or been sealed by the state? Why were all children who bore the mark listed as non-viable in census logs? And why, in modern-day Pleasant Hill, does the symbol still reappear after every attempt to remove it? Ask yourself, who is writing it? And if it's not us, then what wants to be remembered? They say Pleasant Hill ended on the surface. They say the buildings are empty. They say nothing remains beneath the soil but stone and root. They are lying, because beneath the chapel, beneath the dormitories, beneath even the elder grove, there are tunnels, not modern, not functional, not even properly mapped. These tunnels were carved by hand, stone, and chisel at a depth that defies reason for the time. No architectural records mention their construction, no surviving plans explain their purpose. And yet, They exist. In 1983, a state archaeologist named Matthew Clemens visited the site with a team of graduate students. The project was supposed to be routine, just surface documentation for a proposed historical park. But on the third day, they found it. A hatch hidden beneath a rotted communion table, nailed shut with iron spikes blackened by time and heat. Behind it, a narrow stairwell descending into total darkness. No stairs, just dirt, just cold, just the smell. Clemens kept a journal. It was found years later, hidden in a university archive. We followed the shaft down 70 feet. The air didn't feel old. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in our world. The walls weren't natural. They were shaped by tools, curved, purposeful. The deeper we went, the more we noticed the marks, spirals, symbols, tallies etched into the rock. We found ropes, cribs, and what looked like tiny furniture. He wrote one more entry. There's music down here, but no one brought a radio. Clemens vanished 2 days later. The site was closed, declared structurally unstable. No follow-up teams were sent. But that's not the whole story. Locals report strange sounds at night, humming, weeping, low vibrations that rattle window panes. Some say the ground itself groans when the moon is full. Others say they've seen children, pale and silent, standing near the elder grove at dawn. FBI files show 8 unrelated disappearances in the surrounding woods between 1985 and 1997. No signs of struggle, no tracks, no explanation. All 8 were under the age of 12. And here's what no one explains. Why the Pleasant Hill grounds are still maintained. Why the chapel lawn is always cut. Why fresh flowers appear on the stone well every month, even though no family lives within 10 miles. Because something was buried here, and someone, or something, is still tending it. It wasn't a massacre, it wasn't a plague, and it wasn't an accident. What happened in the final days of Pleasant Hill was a ritual, and it was planned for decades. By 1834, the Richardson family had perfected every element of control, psychological, physical, spiritual. But there was one thing they had not yet conquered: legacy. Their empire was collapsing under pressure. External audits, missing persons, whisper networks. They didn't run. They didn't repent. They completed the work. According to a suppressed memo from a 1978 Congressional Archive request, never released to the public, an anonymous federal agent described the contents of a hidden chamber beneath Pleasant Hill's chapel. Circular room, stone walls embedded with teeth. Human, child size. A crude altar in the center, made from kneeling benches, tied together with what appeared to be human hair. On the walls, 313 names scratched in layers, some fresh, some ancient. But here's the thing, every name was crossed out, deliberately, forcefully, as if to erase them from memory, not just record them. The implication: these were the children, not just the ones who lived there, but the ones who vanished. Over 3 decades, children were brought in, some born to the community, others adopted, and still others never accounted for. Every time someone asked where a child had gone, they were told the same thing: returned to God. But no graves were ever found, no farewell letters, no trace, because their bodies weren't meant to be found. Their essence, their energy, was transmuted. The final ritual, as pieced together from declassified fragments and oral testimonies, involved isolation of all non-family members under the guise of illness, drugging of communal meals with extracts from Sister Hannah's apothecary, a harvest ceremony that only Richardson blood was allowed to attend, and finale, the burning of the names one by one in a central pyre built from the children's abandoned beds. Witnesses say the sky turned red that night, not orange, not gold, red like clotting blood. Locals reported screams, but they didn't sound human. Then silence, and by dawn, Pleasant Hill was empty. No struggle, no panic, just absence. The official record? Abandonment due to declining numbers, an economic decision. But here's the truth they fear you'll accept. Souls were consumed to forge a legacy of power that never died. The family vanished, but their pattern did not. It spread into other churches, other communities, other institutions. The name Richardson doesn't appear in modern registers, but their symbols do, their methods do, and the systems of control they built are all around you. If you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a story. It was a map, a warning, and an initiation. Type the phrase, "I see the pattern," twice in the comments to anchor your awareness. Not for the algorithm, for yourself.